When my dad married his new wife, I was 12. Mom had been gone for about 4 years by then. I was still getting used to the idea of her not being around, and honestly, it just felt weird seeing dad with someone else. The new wife wasn't bad or anything, and she seemed okay enough. But things changed when she moved in, bringing her toddler daughter with her. The little girl was maybe 2 or 3, and right from the start, she was like the center of their universe. Suddenly, everything in our house started revolving around her. I was still dealing with losing my mom, so it wasn't like I was super excited to suddenly have this new family thrust upon me. I mean, it was only 4 years since mom died, and I was still trying to figure things out. I'd catch dad looking at me, almost like he felt guilty, but he never really said anything about it. We'd just kind of go through the motions of trying to blend as a family, but it felt awkward, like we were all just pretending to be okay with everything. The one thing I had left of my mom, though, was her engagement ring. That ring had been in our family for generations. My grandma gave it to her, and she'd always said it was meant to be passed down. It was the last piece of her that I could hold on to, a bit of family history I could keep close. I wore it on a necklace because it was a little too big for my fingers. Every time I looked at it, it was like a little reminder that mom was still with me somehow. About a year after dad remarried, his new wife's daughter, the toddler, was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. I didn't really understand what that meant back then, but I knew it was serious. The mood in the house went from tense to just heavy. Everything was about her treatments, her doctor visits, and whatever else she needed. I'd come home from school, and there'd be no one there because they were all at the hospital. I'd eat alone most nights, hearing the quietness of the house and just feeling more and more like an outsider. Then came the day when Dad sat me down in the living room with that serious look on his face. He told me they'd found an experimental treatment that might help the girl, but it wasn't available nearby. They'd have to stay somewhere else for a few months, and the costs were insane. His new wife's family wasn't in the picture, and they didn't have much savings, so they were looking for other ways to pay for it. He looked at me, all serious, and asked if we could sell Mom's engagement ring. I didn't understand at first. Like, what did that have to do with anything? That ring was mine, left to me in her will. It wasn't just some fancy jewelry to sell whenever. It was like the only thing I had left of her. When I told him that, he sighed, then said something like, "This treatment could save her life. It's not like it's just for fun or something." And I remember just sitting there, staring at him, wondering if he really thought it was okay to just take that away from me. He tried to say it was for a greater good, that it was about saving a life. And I mean, yeah, I get that, but I was just a kid myself, barely 13, and he was asking me to give up the one thing that still connected me to my mom. I didn't know how to explain that to him without sounding selfish, which is exactly what he called me when I tried. I told him I wouldn't forgive him if he sold it, that he'd be taking something away from me that I could never get back. But he didn't listen. The next thing I knew, the ring was gone, sold off for $14,000. 14 grand was all it took for him to sell away the last thing I had of my mom. He tried to talk to me about it later, but I wouldn't hear it. To me, it was like he'd just stolen something that didn't belong to him, something that meant way more to me than he'd ever understand. After that, things got weird between us. I pulled away from him, started keeping to myself more. I'd see him with his new family, with his wife and her daughter, and it was like watching him live this new life that didn't include me. Every time I looked at him, I felt this anger building up inside me. I'd catch myself wanting to scream at him, to tell him how much I hated him for what he did, but I held it in. I figured it didn't matter. He'd made his choice. For a while, I just tried to focus on school and friends, anything to distract myself. But that feeling of betrayal didn't go away. I'd come home every day, see them all together, and feel like an outsider in my own house. He'd already chosen his new family over me, and that ring was just the final proof of it. Even when they'd go off for her treatments and leave me home alone, it wasn't like I felt relieved. I was just there, in this house full of memories that didn't mean anything to anyone else. I stopped talking to him about anything important. If he asked about school, I'd just give short answers. When he'd try to make plans to do something together, I'd brush him off, pretending I was busy or didn't feel like it. Part of me hoped he'd notice, that he'd realize what he'd done and apologize. But he never did. He'd just keep trying to make it work, acting like nothing was wrong. By the time I was getting close to 18, I was already planning my escape. I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. Every time I thought about how he'd sold Mom's ring, it felt like a fresh wound, like he'd chosen his new family's needs over my right to have something that connected me to her. I started saving every little bit I could, planning my exit. I wanted out of there, far away from a place that didn't feel like home anymore. I guess some people might say I was overreacting, but when you're 13 and someone takes something so important from you, it messes with your head. It's not just about the ring itself, it's about what it stood for. That ring was my link to a family I'd lost, a memory of a mom I could barely remember clearly. Losing it felt like losing her all over again, and no one understood that, especially not my dad. The years after my dad sold the ring were strange. I thought maybe I'd get used to it, like eventually I'd be able to let it go and move on, but that just didn't happen. If anything, the anger and resentment kept building up. Every time I looked at my dad, I'd just see the guy who chose someone else's kid over his own, who took the one thing left of my mom and gave it away like it was nothing. And it didn't help that, in those years, I felt like I was just there, a shadow in their new family. I figured out pretty quick that I couldn't depend on him for support or really anything. There were days I'd come home and they wouldn't even be there. They'd be off at a hospital visit or staying with friends near the treatment center, leaving me alone to fend for myself. They tried to set me up with meals and stuff, like they'd leave frozen dinners in the freezer, or sometimes ask a neighbor to check in on me, but it always felt like an afterthought. Like they had their priorities and I just wasn't one of them. And let me tell you, it was hard to shake off that feeling of being forgotten. I'd sit in that quiet house, knowing they were out there trying to save her, and I'd just get angrier. Angry that they'd left me to take care of myself. Angry that Dad didn't seem to care. And mostly angry that this was supposed to be my home. But it didn't feel like one. It was like I was a stranger under my own roof. I decided pretty early on that I was getting out of there as soon as I could. I started working part-time jobs, saving up whatever I could. I mowed lawns, babysat, and eventually worked at a grocery store after school and on weekends. It wasn't much, but it was something. My plan was simple. Hit 18, save up enough, and get out. I didn't want any more reminders of what I'd lost or what he'd done. When I hit my senior year, things got even more strained. My dad would occasionally try to have these father-daughter talks, where he'd tell me how proud he was of me, how he knew I was going to do great things. But at that point, it just sounded like empty words. I wasn't some little kid anymore, and he couldn't just patch things up with a few "I'm proud of you" comments. And he never once apologized or admitted he'd messed up. I kept waiting, hoping that maybe he'd say he was sorry, that he'd see the damage he'd done. But he never did. It was like he thought it was all fine now, like he'd just moved on from everything, so I should too. I remember one day he tried to talk to me about college. He asked if I'd thought about where I wanted to go or what I wanted to study. I shrugged him off, told him I didn't know yet. The truth was, I didn't want to talk to him about my future because in my mind, he wasn't really part of it. I was planning to move out, start my life on my own terms, and I didn't want him involved. I'd been on my own for so long, I'd learned how to be independent, and the thought of him trying to play dad now just felt insulting. As graduation got closer, the tension between us was at an all-time high. He kept trying to act like everything was normal, like we were just a regular father and daughter dealing with typical teen parent issues. But we weren't. Not by a long shot. I couldn't even look at him without feeling that same flash of anger. And I think he knew it because he'd look at me sometimes with this sad, almost defeated expression, like he knew he'd lost something but couldn't figure out what. I saved every penny I could from my jobs, determined to leave as soon as I could. I didn't care where I'd go, just that it would be somewhere I could finally breathe, somewhere I didn't have to keep living in this strange shadow of a family. The closer I got to 18, the more restless I felt, like I was counting down the days until I'd be free. The night before I moved out, I remember packing up my stuff in my room, looking around at the walls and thinking about all the memories that I was leaving behind. It was bittersweet. This had been my home, the place where I grew up, where I spent the happiest years with my mom. But it wasn't that place anymore. Not since he'd sold her ring. Not since he'd chosen them over me. Dad tried to talk to me before I left. He stood there in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking like he wanted to say something profound, but all he managed was, "I know we've had our differences, but you'll always be my daughter." I just nodded, gave him this forced smile, and didn't say anything back. I didn't want to get into it with him, didn't want to drag out the goodbye. In my head, he'd lost the right to call me his daughter the moment he sold that ring. So, I packed my stuff, threw my bags in the car, and left without looking back. I'd saved up enough to get a small apartment. It wasn't much, just a cramped little place with barely enough room to swing a cat, but it was mine. And that meant everything. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. There was no constant reminder of the family I'd lost or the betrayal I'd felt. It was just me, my space, and the chance to start over. At first, being on my own was weird. I'd spent so many years fending for myself that actual independence felt surreal. But as the days passed, I started settling into a routine. I'd wake up, go to work, come home, and it felt good. Peaceful even. I didn't have to worry about Dad or his new family. I didn't have to deal with their drama or the constant reminders of what had happened. Of course, Dad tried to stay in touch. He'd call occasionally, leave these long voicemails asking how I was doing, telling me he missed me. I ignored most of them. Sometimes I'd listen, but only out of curiosity. Part of me kept waiting for him to say he was sorry, that he'd realized he'd messed up and wanted to make things right. But that apology never came. It was always the same old, "I miss you," or "I just want to hear from you," like he couldn't understand why I'd left or why I didn't want to talk to him. After a few months, I got my first real job, something that paid enough to let me keep the apartment and cover my bills. Life was simple, and I liked it that way. I didn't need anyone's pity or help. I'd made it on my own, and I was proud of that. It wasn't until much later that I realized just how much leaving had changed me. I was tougher, more guarded. I didn't let people in easily because I knew what it felt like to be betrayed by the ones you trusted most. But even with all that, there was still this tiny part of me that wanted closure, that wanted to know if he ever regretted what he'd done. But I wasn't going to wait around for that answer. I'd spent too long waiting on him to do the right thing, to be the dad I needed. I was done with that. Moving out wasn't just about getting my own space. It was about finally letting go of everything that had held me back. And as far as I was concerned, that was the best decision I'd ever made. I'd been on my own for a while by then. I got used to the peace, the independence, and honestly, I didn't miss them. There was a certain freedom in being able to live without constantly thinking about family drama, or wondering if Dad would ever apologize. I was finally past it, or at least I thought I was. Then one day, completely out of the blue, I get a call from my dad. I'd almost forgotten what it sounded like when he said, "Hi, kiddo," in that awkward, fake cheerful voice he used whenever he had bad news. He didn't waste any time before diving into the reason for his call, telling me his wife's daughter was sick again, that the cancer was back. He sounded strained, like he was already bracing himself for what he'd have to ask, and I knew deep down that there was only one reason he'd reach out after all this time. Turns out I was right. After all these years, he was asking for money. My own dad was calling me, not to apologize, not to make things right, but to ask for a handout to help his new family. He gave me this whole speech about how they were drowning in medical bills, how things were tight, and that every little bit would help. He mentioned the money he'd saved up for me before he got remarried. It wasn't a lot, just a few $1,000 he'd set aside for my future back when I was little, but he was hoping I'd pitch in. It felt like a slap to the face. I asked him straight up why he thought I'd want to help after everything. He stumbled over his words, trying to explain that he thought maybe enough time had passed and that surely I didn't still hold a grudge. He said it was for a good cause, that I had the chance to make a difference. Like this was all some noble gesture, not another way for him to bail himself out of the mess he made. I didn't hold back. I told him exactly what I thought, that he had no right to ask me for anything after selling my mom's ring. I said it was insulting that he even thought I'd consider it, especially after he'd never bothered to apologize. He kept trying to say I was being unreasonable, that I should let go of the past. He sounded like he genuinely believed I was in the wrong for being upset about the ring, and then he started bringing up his stepdaughter's condition, saying how she didn't deserve this and how I should be compassionate. I told him compassion goes both ways. I reminded him how he chose them over me, over my mom's memory, and then acted like everything was fine afterward. He got quiet, which I thought meant he'd finally understood. But no, he just sighed and said, "I wish you could let it go." That was the moment I knew he'd never really get it. Then his wife started calling me. She'd text, leave voicemails, even sent emails, all trying to guilt trip me. She'd say stuff like, "It's not about you, it's about saving a child's life," and "We're family, we should help each other." I guess she thought that bringing up the family card would somehow make me cave, but honestly, it had the opposite effect. Every message just reminded me how they'd thrown me aside when I was still a kid. I was family now that they needed money, but back then I was just an inconvenience to be brushed off. After ignoring her for a while, she tried a new approach. One day, she left this long, drawn-out voicemail about how the ring had saved her daughter's life, and how I should be grateful that it went to something so meaningful. The audacity of it left me speechless. She was seriously trying to twist it like I was the bad guy for wanting to keep my mom's last gift. I didn't even respond to that one. I just deleted it and blocked her number. It didn't end there, though. Somehow, she got the rest of the family involved. Aunts, uncles, even cousins who barely knew me growing up, they all started chiming in. Some messaged me directly, others just posted passive-aggressive stuff on social media about family values and putting others first. It was a circus, and it was exhausting. I ended up deleting a bunch of my social media profiles just to get some peace. One night, though, I got a message from my grandmother. She's usually pretty chill, keeps to herself, but this time, she'd clearly been roped into the mess. She wrote this long, awkward message about how family needs to stick together and that my dad's stepdaughter was going through an unspeakably hard time. I felt bad for her, but I was tired of being guilted. I sent a simple reply, explaining that my dad had already chosen his family years ago when he sold the ring, and that he didn't get to come crawling back now just because they were short on cash. She didn't respond after that, and I could tell it had stung, but I wasn't about to apologize for setting boundaries. Things hit a new low when I ran into my dad's wife in public. I was grabbing some groceries, minding my own business, and she just appeared out of nowhere, standing right in front of me in the middle of the aisle. At first, I thought she'd just walk by or pretend not to see me, but no, she went straight into her speech about how selfish I was, how disgusting it was that I could even think about keeping the money while her daughter was fighting for her life. I was done holding back. I told her that the ring had meant more to me than she or her daughter ever could, and that she was lucky I hadn't taken legal action when my dad sold it. I reminded her that it was my right to keep whatever money I had, and that if she needed funds so badly, there were other ways to get help. She looked at me like I was the devil, muttered something under her breath, and stormed off. I could feel people staring, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let her bully me into giving up the last bit of security I had. Walking out of that store, I felt weirdly relieved. For so long, I'd held all that anger in, let it simmer under the surface. But finally, I'd stood up for myself. I'd drawn a line, told her exactly where I stood, and didn't back down. And yeah, maybe it felt a little ruthless, but it was better than just sitting back and letting them guilt trip me. After that, things quieted down for a bit. The calls stopped, and I didn't get any more messages from random family members. I think they realized I wasn't going to budge. But there was still this nagging feeling, this little voice in the back of my head that kept asking if I was in the wrong. I mean, yeah, they'd hurt me, and they had no right to ask for my money, but part of me still wondered if I was being too harsh. Maybe I'd just gotten so used to being angry that I'd forgotten what it was like to feel anything else. It was a hard thing to shake, that guilt. Even though I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, I still couldn't help questioning myself. That's the thing about family. They know exactly where to hit you, where it'll hurt the most. And even when you're standing up for yourself, there's this part of you that wonders if they're right. But in the end, I had to remind myself that I'd spent years putting up with their choices, their disregard for my feelings, and I wasn't going to let them pull me back in. I'd finally started to build a life for myself, and I wasn't about to let them tear that down just because they didn't like my answer. So I stuck to my guns, blocked them again, and moved on. At least, that's what I kept telling myself I was doing. After the grocery store confrontation with my dad's wife, I thought things might finally calm down. I'd told her straight up how I felt, and I figured that maybe, just maybe, they'd get the message and leave me alone. But if anything, things only got worse. Within a few days, it was like the whole extended family had decided to form some kind of intervention. Everyone suddenly had an opinion on what I should do and how I needed to make things right. I'd see these random texts from family members I hadn't heard from in years, all talking about how family helps family. A few of them went on about how unforgiving I was being, and that grudges only poison the person holding them. It felt like they were reading from the same script, probably fed by my dad or his wife. It was like they'd turned me into the villain, the person who was too cold-hearted to help a sick child, which wasn't even close to the truth. The worst part was when they started tagging me in posts on social media. I'd see these guilt-trippy quotes on my feed like, "When we're gone, all we have is family," or "A heart that forgives is a heart that heals." I'd roll my eyes so hard I could practically see my own brain. Eventually, I decided to delete a bunch of them. I didn't need that kind of pressure or manipulation. But of course, that led to more drama, with people messaging me saying stuff like, "How could you delete me? You're acting like a stranger to your own family." It got so ridiculous that I just started ignoring everything. But they kept pushing. A few days later, I got a long email from my dad's sister, who I barely spoke to even before all this. She wrote about how family was all we had in this world, and that I should show some compassion. She actually had the nerve to tell me that I was too young to understand, as if I hadn't lived through my own experience and had my own feelings about it. It was like no one could see my side, like I was just supposed to put aside years of hurt and betrayal because they suddenly decided it was convenient. But the thing that really set me off was a group message from my dad's parents. My grandparents were always a little distant with me, mostly because they'd been close to my dad's wife from the beginning and thought she'd breathed new life into him after my mom passed away. They basically saw her as a savior and acted like her daughter was just as much their granddaughter as I was. But in this message, they took it a step further. They wrote about how they understood that I was still hurt, but that I needed to let go of the past. They talked about how my dad's stepdaughter was like family, and how, as her older sibling, I had a responsibility to support her during this hard time. They finished it off by saying, "We know your mom would want you to do the right thing." That was it for me. That last line about my mom was like a punch to the gut. Here they were, using my mom's memory, something they barely respected in the first place, to try to guilt me into giving them money. I remember just staring at the screen, feeling this mix of rage and sadness. It was like they didn't just take away the last piece of her when they sold the ring. Now they were dragging her memory into this mess just to make me feel guilty. I sat down that night and wrote out a response. I wasn't going to keep quiet anymore. I told them that they had no right to bring my mom into this, that they had no idea what she would have wanted because they'd barely acknowledged her after she was gone. I reminded them that the ring had been mine and mine alone, and that my dad had no right to sell it. I laid it all out, the hurt, the betrayal, everything. And I told them that if they didn't respect my decision to stay out of their mess, I'd have no choice but to cut contact. I hit send and just sat there feeling this weird sense of relief. I didn't know how they'd respond, but I didn't care. For the first time, I'd actually told them how I felt instead of bottling it up. But of course, the fallout came almost immediately. First, my grandma sent this half-hearted apology, saying she was sorry I felt that way, which is the kind of non-apology that basically means, sorry you're upset, but I'm not changing anything. Then, one by one, family members started dropping like flies. People blocked me, unfriended me, and my phone got quieter. I wasn't going to lie, it hurt. But it was also like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I didn't have to keep defending myself or dealing with the constant manipulation. Then my dad showed up at my door. I hadn't seen him in months, maybe a year by that point. I wasn't expecting it, so when I opened the door and saw him standing there, I froze. He looked older, more worn down, like all the drama had taken a toll on him. But the second he opened his mouth, I knew he hadn't come to make things right. "I thought you'd at least have the decency to talk to me face to face," he said, looking around like he didn't really want to be there. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Talk about what? You made your choice a long time ago." He sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable. "I'm doing everything I can to help your sister," he said. That word, sister, made my blood boil. I told him, flat out, that she wasn't my sister, that she was his wife's daughter, and nothing more. He looked at me like I'd slapped him, but I wasn't about to back down. After all this time, I wasn't going to let him rewrite history just because it suited him. "Why can't you just let it go?" he asked, shaking his head. "You're holding on to a grudge over a ring." "It wasn't just a ring," I snapped. "It was Mom's ring, and you sold it like it was nothing. And now you're coming back for more, acting like I owe you something." We stood there in silence for what felt like forever. Finally, he just looked down, sighed, and said, "You're not the person I raised." I laughed at that, a short, bitter laugh. "No, I'm not. I'm the person you ignored for years while you built a new life with your new family. And now that it's falling apart, you're looking to me to fix it. I'm done, Dad. I'm done being your backup plan." Without another word, I stepped back, closed the door, and locked it. I watched from the window as he just stood there for a minute, looking lost, like he couldn't believe what had just happened. Eventually, he turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped. It should have felt satisfying, maybe even triumphant, but it didn't. It just felt final. I sat down in my apartment, feeling this strange mix of relief and sadness. It was like a chapter of my life had just ended, and I wasn't sure what would come next. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let him or anyone else guilt me into being part of their drama again. I'd fought too hard to get to where I was, and I wasn't about to let them drag me back down. For the first time, I actually felt free. I wasn't tangled up in their expectations or guilt trips anymore. I could just focus on myself, on moving forward. And while part of me would probably always wish things had been different, I knew I'd made the right choice. After shutting the door on my dad, it was like everything finally fell into place. For the first time in years, I didn't have that constant feeling of waiting for something, some apology or acknowledgement that was never going to come. I told him exactly how I felt, let it all out, and ended it on my own terms. And for the first time, I was genuinely done. The silence that followed was almost unsettling at first. After all the calls, messages, and guilt trips, I'd gotten used to the constant background noise of family drama. But now there was just peace. No random phone calls, no passive-aggressive social media posts from distant relatives, no one telling me how I was supposed to feel. Just me, my little apartment, and the life I'd built for myself. Of course, even with all that freedom, the doubts crept in sometimes. It's hard to walk away from people you've known your whole life, no matter how much pain they caused. I'd think back to holidays or random weekends, the times my dad would actually be around, and I'd get hit with that weird feeling of nostalgia mixed with regret. But then, I'd remember the last few years, the constant betrayal, and I'd snap out of it. I'd remind myself that I didn't need them to be happy. Work helped a lot. I threw myself into my job, put in the hours, and tried to build something for myself. And as time went on, I started making new friends, people who had no idea about all the drama and didn't look at me like I was the estranged daughter or the girl with family issues. It was refreshing, and it felt like I could finally move on without the weight of my past hanging over me. About a month after my last confrontation with my dad, I got a message from my aunt, one of the few people who hadn't picked a side in the whole mess. She'd always been a bit of a neutral party, someone who'd send a quick text on my birthday or check in every now and then, but never too involved. She said she just wanted to make sure I was doing all right, especially after all the family stuff. Part of me wanted to ignore it, just let sleeping dogs lie, but another part of me was curious, so I messaged her back, keeping it casual. I told her things were fine, that I was focusing on work and keeping my distance from all the drama. She replied with a lot of "I understand," and that must have been hard, which felt a bit like she was trying to avoid saying too much. Then, out of nowhere, she dropped a bombshell. Apparently, my dad and his wife had hit a financial rough patch. Between the medical bills, their other expenses, and whatever else they'd been dealing with, they were stretched thin. My aunt didn't go into details, but she hinted that they were struggling more than I'd realized. They'd even put their house up for sale, probably to cover whatever debt they'd racked up from the treatments and everything else. Hearing that should have made me feel something. Maybe a bit of pity, maybe satisfaction, maybe even a pang of guilt. But honestly, I just felt nothing. It was like I'd reached the end of a story I'd stopped caring about a long time ago. I didn't wish them any harm, but I wasn't going to go running back to help them either. They'd made their choices, just like I'd made mine. My aunt wrapped up her message with, "I thought you should know. It's still family after all." And that part stuck with me for a while. What does family even mean when they treat you like an afterthought? When they only reach out because they need something, not because they actually care about you? I realized that just because we shared blood didn't mean I owed them anything. Family wasn't just about DNA, it was about people who actually had your back, who respected you and valued you. And that wasn't them. In the months that followed, I put my focus back on the people who had been there for me. My friends, the distant relatives who actually checked in out of genuine care, not out of obligation. I started to see that the family I chose was worth so much more than the one I was born into. My dad and his wife had taken enough from me over the years. I wasn't going to let them take my peace too. Eventually, the calls and messages faded completely. I guess they finally realized that I wasn't going to be their fallback, that they couldn't keep me on the hook with guilt or family loyalty, and I was okay with that. I'd spent too many years trying to be the daughter they wanted, waiting for them to see me, to value me. But those days were over. I was done waiting for something that was never coming. Sometimes people would ask me about my family, new friends, co-workers, people who didn't know the whole story. They'd say things like, "Are you close with your parents?" Or, "Do you have any siblings?" And I'd just smile and give a simple answer. "No, it's just me." It was easier that way, and it felt right. I didn't need to explain the whole backstory or dive into all the drama. All they needed to know was that I was okay on my own. And honestly, I was more than okay. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally living for myself, not constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if my dad would finally come around. I didn't need his approval or his apologies. I'd given myself permission to let go, to move on, and that was all the closure I needed. By the time the year rolled around, I'd created a life that was entirely mine. My career was going well. I had a close-knit group of friends who felt more like family than my own ever did, and I'd finally found peace with everything that had happened. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I'd gone through it all, felt every bit of that pain, and come out stronger on the other side. Looking back, I realized that losing them had actually set me free. It forced me to find strength I didn't know I had, to stand up for myself in ways I never thought I could. And while it hadn't been easy, it was worth it. I was finally living on my own terms with people who actually cared about me. So, here I am now, finally closing that chapter for good. No more wondering, what if? No more waiting for apologies that would never come. Just me, living my life, free from all the weight I'd carried for so long. I may not have the family I once imagined, but I have a life I can be proud of, and that's enough for me.